So welcome to the Node.js Technical Steering Committee meeting for 11th January 2023. Before we get started, does anybody have any announcements they'd like to share? Okay, if not, we'll move on to the CPC and board meeting updates. Any CPC updates, Rich?
No, it was a working meeting this week. No updates.
Okay. Just taking, saying there's no updates. I don't know why I suddenly went to bold, but moving on to the first one. The first one's tagged as 46100 doc at experimental stages. I know this was on the agenda before, but I think Jeffrey, you had a few more things you wanted to discuss in the meeting this week.
Yeah. So yeah, we discussed this last week. I thought we had consensus, and then I got a whole bunch of blocks on this, but fortunately people were very gracious and removed their blocks after a lot of discussion. So now at the moment it has 4 approvals. It's this one, in case you remember. It's just a docs update. Well, you can read it, but it just adds this text, adding like some bullets underneath the experimental in the stages, the list of our stability index. It adds a few bullets under experimental, explaining like some sub stages within experimental. So I was initially assuming that we would, well, first off, I should say, like, if anyone who's on this call has any notes or feedback related to this, let's discuss it here, because it's a lot, it's a lot of effort for me to keep constantly responding to people on the thread. So I'd love to just chat about it while we're together if we can. And the particular question that I had, which hopefully we can get consensus on, is should we land this now before updating any of the rest of the docs to say, like, not just that something's experimental, but that it's 1.0 or 1.1 or 1.2, early development, active development, release candidate. Like, there's something like 100 or so features that are currently marked as experimental, so it'll probably take a long time to go and update all of those. So we might not want to leave this just hanging unmerged for all that time while we're updating everything. On the other hand, it might be confusing to people if we have a index that says experimental and then substages, but then those substages aren't, mentioned elsewhere under the particular features. So I don't really know what to do. I was initially assuming we would wait until everything was updated and land everything together. I think Darshan commented suggesting the opposite, and I'm like, oh sure, I'm happy to land this sooner if we can. So I just wanted to ask everybody else what you guys thought, and then any other notes about this.
I'm wondering, a while not too long ago, we had a discussion about security expectations for experimental features, as in what guarantees do we make for experimental features? Do we accept bug reports, reports of vulnerabilities in experimental features, etc.? Does this have any relation to this? Is there any difference between these different experimental stages when it comes to security?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we haven't discussed that, and the text doesn't talk about security at all. So I would assume, nothing's changed in that regard.
So that means we'd have the same security expectations for 1.0, which means early development, and for 1.2, which means it's a release candidate?
So this just defines what the stages are, which is basically really only talks about them on one dimension, which is like how mature we think the feature is. It doesn't talk about like how secure we think it is or not, how you know, how impactful it is. You know, like there are other considerations that people might make in terms of like whether something is 1.0 versus 1.2, et cetera. This is just like for the general public, we are going to use these buckets to classify things. Now, in terms of like how we decide which of these stages to put a particular feature in, that's something, you know, when we go through and classify all the features, that's like, we'll have to, you know, try to come up with that. The other thing that this doesn't do is define any requirements for each stage. That like is explicitly, like we talked about that last week and in the discussion here, that like there was some talk about like, well, we should have a flag maybe for the first stage or the first two stages and no flag for the third stage or something along those lines. The idea was to like land this first to just establish, okay, we're gonna have 3 stages and here's what they're named. And then separate discussion over, do we even want them to be requirements? Should they be recommendations? Should they be guidelines? You know, et cetera. Like figure out probably something in the collaborators guide of like, so you want to land a new feature, you know, here's first, should it be experimental or not? Like maybe it's small enough or not risky enough or whatever that it doesn't need to go through the experimental process. If it goes through the experimental process, should it start as 1.0 or 1.1? Or even, I guess, 1.2, I don't know. I'm assuming you'll start in one of the other ones. And then, you know, should you use a flag? And then we'll probably write some considerations for what things need a flag or not, et cetera, et cetera. So I would assume that security would be falling under all that, like how to land security related features, et cetera, et cetera. We would kind of figure that out as part of writing our guidance for contributors. But if anyone has any other idea, by all means, I'm just trying to answer the question for myself. So I'm not trying to speak for everybody. So
I think my same thought, just echoing what you said, is like, we could have a discussion on like this, do we have different requirements or different promises for security from different ones, but that should be a follow-on discussion. We're trying to divorce the longer discussions from a, should we just even have them categorized out, which is what this PR is trying to do.
I mean, another thought could be that it could be a distinction more between having a flag and not. Like we're not committing with this that certain stages will have flags or won't. So, but it could be that maybe there's a harder requirement for security related features that like they need to have a flag until they're, you know, until we consider them to be secure or something to that effect. You know, we could figure that out when we work out those details around flags and promoting features to stability, et cetera.
Yeah, I wasn't so much concerned with security specific features, more about the security of any feature that we add. Let's say we add quick as a separate module or something, then we probably, I don't know what security expectations we can have from the quick implementation, given that it's a huge code base and that it's super complicated. So I was just wondering if we'd have different expectations, and you answered that. So that would be a follow-up thing.
I mean, I think I would consider that just part of stability in general. Like if something's not marked as stable, then it's much more likely. I mean, even something that's stable can have bugs or can have security vulnerabilities, right? But like something that's not marked as stable is much more likely to have those issues, and security is just one of those types of issues, I would think, right? So
sure, I believe it was more about which security issues are we going to fix privately, which are we going to fix publicly, etc., depending on whether something's experimental or not. And I believe we came to the conclusion that we should fix all issues privately, even for experimental features, but I might be misremembering.
I mean, that hasn't even come up in the discussions related to this. So I think the assumption is nothing has changed, like with regard to that. I see in the chat is a warning generally expected at 1.2. So there was an earlier discussion thread that proposed essentially that, but there wasn't consensus on that, and so we removed. I'm calling those the requirements, like, oh, 1.1 requires a flag or requires a flag and a warning or whatever. None of that is in this PR. The thought is to land this first and then start a discussion of, do we want requirements or should they be recommendations? And if so, what should they be? Should there be a warning should release candidate have just a warning, no flag, or maybe no flag or no warning? We don't know. Like, that's going to be I think that's going to take a longer discussion to haggle that out and try to get everyone to agree on something. And the idea was like, this is simple enough that like, okay, let's at least establish a framework that 3 stages. Now within those 3 stages, let's talk and figure out what it's going to be.
Nikita, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, so I was not talking about requirements, because having that as hard requirement is probably unrealistic, because in some cases we just can't add a warning.
In some
I
cases,
think,
we can't what? I'm sorry?
we just can't add a warning in some cases, I think, for experimental features. I don't think that warning is always possible. But yes, I was talking mostly about recommendations or expectations. And if at this point we land this PR and we don't yet expect that stage 1.2 will have a warning, then my concern is that the border between stage 1.2 and stage 2 is very unclear. And that even if we land this as a framework currently and start using it and start labeling something as stage 1.2 experimental, then the ecosystem will just use it as if it is stable and might have the same expectations of the APIs as of stable APIs. Because it is documented, like the documentation for stage 1.2 is very close to documentation for stage 2. And if it will behave just the same and won't have the warning, and if several features pass from 1.2 to 2 without breaking changes, then the ecosystem will just start treating stage 1.2 exactly the same as stage 2. That is what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, in the discussion that preceded this, I said that, like, I think even 1.2 should require a warning specifically so that it doesn't just become, people just start using it as if it's done when it's really not. And also that way, like, it encourages people to actually go back and get their feature, or I mean, that was the discussion. I'm not saying that this is, we haven't written the recommendations yet or the requirements, whatever they turn out to be. But just the earlier draft that we were discussing about, it suggested for the like release candidate phase, there would still be a warning. That way people would be motivated to actually get their features pushed into stable. Because I think a big reason we have over 100 experimental features right now is that, like, especially for ones that don't have a flag or don't have a warning, what's the motivation for anyone to ever go back and like finish them? You know what I mean? It's like they're de facto stable except on the docs, so it's sort of like they're just kind of like lingering there forever. But again, people have very strong feelings about flags and warnings, so we can discuss that in the follow-up if we want to require it, if we want to even recommend it. I don't know. We'll have to, maybe it's case by case or it differs by subsystem or who knows. So we can figure that out.
Okay, this is not a blocker, just a concern that I see, and if that seems okay, then I don't have objections to this.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the very next step would be trying to draft that guidance. So I think there will be a hopefully not too long gap between this landing and, like, it may be a while because, as we said, it's, it'll take a while to reach consensus, but it shouldn't be forever that there isn't that guidance to help make it a little bit clearer.
So, so what about the question of whether to land this now, or, I mean, we certainly don't want to wait until we've written the guidance to land this. I think we could wait to classify all the features in the docs that are experimental before landing this, but I am getting intimidated by how much work it's going to be, because especially with some of the more arcane features where no one's thought about it in years, it might take us a while to come up with what we think the proper stage should be. So I'm starting to lean towards actually just landing this sooner than later, but I wanted to hear from everybody else.
I'm wondering if we would find any problems with the current classification, sorry, with the current categories if we try to actually classify all experimental features. If we don't try to classify those, there's no real way of knowing if there's any problems with the categories that you've designed.
I thought about that, but I feel like if that happens, then we could just do another PR to add or remove a category. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure, but
it's not set in stone.
if those are open to change, then why land it now? If those are not going to be the final categories, I mean, we can land it on main and not release it anywhere, but I don't really see much of a point in that. Are you anticipating one big PR for all classifications, or are you anticipating like dozens
no,
of
I
PRs?
was thinking maybe like one PR per system. Like I put a link on the TSC meeting of just what it looks like in modules, which is like the area where I focus. And there's something like a dozen experimental features in modules. So like there could be one PR that adds the stages for all of those, you know. Maybe some systems have only one experimental feature or whatnot, and so we could do a PR that does a bunch of systems at once or something. But like, yeah, the idea was to like kind of group it by topic area, and that way you can tag the appropriate people. Like I can do a modules classification PR, tag the modules team, etc. And it's not some huge PR that tags, 100 people or something. I mean,
Okay,
I feel
I think as long as we don't release the change and only merge it into main, I'm not objecting to that. So if I don't see a point in releasing a scale that we don't know if it's going to be final. We don't know if we are ever going to apply it. We don't know if it has any use.
I mean,
But
nothing's
just
ever
merging
final in the sense that we can always change anything.
right.
So I don't
In
think the
my opinion,
intention is to change this, but
right, we should try to. We are essentially, as Colin said, we are creating 6 different stages of like code readiness or API readiness, and changing that more frequently should definitely not be a goal, right? So just having
sure.
6 stages seems rather. It seems like many different. Well, okay, admittedly, one is deprecated, one is legacy, but still having that many different API stages, we should try to keep those as consistent as possible.
Sure.
So I guess Tobias, you're suggesting like we would land it on main, but mark it as like don't backport.
Well, I mean, it's up to the releasers, I guess, but I don't see much of a point in having it on the website, having it in downloads, when we don't actually classify any APIs according to these categories and might end up changing it again.
Right. Then I could understand that. Then we get into a situation where we've got this PR, we've got it marked don't backport, but then one subsystem has done it. Do we also mark that one as don't backport? Because like I don't think that one should land or be backported or until the thing that it like if it's going to say we're at stage experimental Y, that shouldn't land until we have the description of what Y means, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I don't want to make the
I
process
mean,
any more complicated.
what
So
if-
if someone feels that it should be
Well,
released, then
how about this? We could land this, mark it as don't backport. I could at least do the PR for modules. That'll give us like a dozen examples of applying this. We could maybe do 1 or 2 other systems as, I guess 2 or 3 other PRs alongside it. If we can get those done relatively quickly, like, over a few weeks, not months, then maybe we could land that first set together. Like, okay, we've covered 20 of the 100 features, they all fit into these 3 stages. Likely then these 3 are going to work for the other 80 or whatever. Then we can, land the first batch and then just keep going, working our way through. Does that work?
Sounds reasonable to me, and we might also learn more about the different categories at that point as to what is typically behind a flag, what is not, and like all these side effects of these categories.
I mean, the other thing is that I think there are a lot of features that are ready to just be stable. Like something that's been unflagged and no warning for years, like it's de facto stable. So unless there's some like major open issue with it, like we'll probably just mark it as stable. And I mean, that should probably be a separate PR or something, but that's the other thing I'm expecting to happen out of this is that, we've never quite done a cleanup of leftover experimental features. I mean, there also might be a few that are just like unfinished and they haven't been touched in years. So maybe we should just remove them as like abandoned, but we won't know until we go through it.
Yeah, I don't think this change is gonna solve all our problems. For example, we frequently add
course not.
Samba minor features that are not being marked as experimental just because it's an addition to an existing API. It's not experimental and it turns out to be problematic. But it's essentially beyond 1.2. We already committed to the API, and many experimental features are probably more stable than some of these Samba minor changes that we made without going through any experimental stages. And yeah, I don't think this is going to help there, but maybe it's a good opportunity to rethink how we add Samba minor things.
I would where did I put the link? Yeah, I would encourage you to look at this. Like this is what I found when I looked at what happened with modules over the last few years. There were a lot of features in here that arguably were like very minor or add-ons of bigger things, like experimental resolve self, where we allow looking up by the name field and package.json. Like, I think that's just like one PR. Like, I'm not even sure that needed to go through an experimental process. Maybe that's not the best example, but like, there are. Yeah, I mean, this isn't going to solve that problem. All I was going to say is that like, what could solve that problem is just being a little more aggressive about using flags and going through experimental process, even though you might not need to. I think it's more of like a culture thing where like the modules team is like very cautious because we're very nervous about releasing, especially because like a lot of our features get used by packages. So it's sort of like if we had released experimental specifier resolution unflagged, we would never be able to get rid of it because there would be, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of packages in the NPM registry relying on it. And then users are like indirectly relying on those. And so like, even though it's experimental, we wouldn't have been able to ever make breaking changes to it or remove it because we'd be breaking all these users that didn't even know they were using it because they're like transitively opting into it, So at least for modules, flags have been really important in letting us land things with some degree of like comfort that we're not going to be locked in by it and be able to change it to fix bugs and so on. That's why I kind of wrote the initial suggestion of this stage has this flag and blah blah blah, kind of with this experience in mind. Although, yeah, I recognize that like other systems, certainly like the test runner, for example, should have very different expectations. Like if it's never going to be used in production, if it can't be used by a dependency, etc., then we should probably have different recommendations for it or expectations for it. So we can hash all that out, I think, in the follow-up.
So I'm just pasting into the chat what I wrote in the minutes in terms of like, I think the candidate plan we've got, at least for the people here for consensus, is like we're okay landing this PR in advance of other things being marked, but markers don't backport. Work to get PRs for 2 to 3 I think I should have said subsystems. That will help us validate, and then we can backport those along with the initial one. That sound right to everybody here?
Can I actually get, I don't know, a thumbs up or something from people? 'Cause I feel like I did this last time where I'm like, hey, everyone okay with me posting this PR? And then I got 3 blocks on it, so just to make sure that everyone's like actually here and listening and so on.
I don't see a Zoom reaction, but I'm somewhere between plus 0.6 and plus 1 on this. I'm in favor of it, and I'm not sure that I'm prepared to push for it, but I definitely prefer that we do something like this over not. I hope that's adequate.
I mean, I'll comment on the PR, like, per TSC meeting, we're gonna whatever Michael wrote, we're gonna land this, but market is not backport, and I'll give it at least. I think it's been open for over a week, so I could just land it, but I'll wait at least until tomorrow before landing it in case anyone has any objection. But yeah, all right. I've asked you all. If you didn't respond, I don't know. I guess you'll just block the PR, but I asked.
Okay,
Any
so
other
anything
things
more on
about
that one?
this? Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay, if not, let's move on to the next one, which is events, bootstrap, make global list, extend event target. I did look at that because I remembered that we discussed it last week. We left a comment on an issue. There's still some ongoing discussion in an issue, but I don't think anything that changes discussion for the TSC. I think we can just remove it from the agenda for now, unless anybody has something that, we think we should discuss. That's my proposal. Okay, I don't hear any people jumping in, so I will remove the TSC agenda item. If I got that wrong, we can always add it back in. The next one was then expose MGT's proxy agent and set global dispatcher within Node.js.
Isn't that one also waiting on Mateo?
Yeah, Mateo was the one who added that to the agenda. I don't think there's anything urgent on this one. Like, I don't know the specific question he has. My understanding of reading it is that like those may not be stable. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I'd agree we wouldn't do that. But so maybe I'd say I propose we wait until next meeting when Mateo's here.
Yeah, I would just bump it until Mateo can be here.
Okay, I think at this point, what I'd suggest is we move on, we, call it for today and reserve a little bit of time for the private section. Are there any other topics we should discuss before we do that? Okay, well, thanks for everybody who's